Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory and you're watching the Varietal literature. A sort of commune of writers from Vancouver. And tonight we are reading horror stories from I don't know if you'd call them masters, but at least the old masters of horror. In particular, tonight we are reading Edgar Allan Poe, which of course we weren't going to make it through October without reading some Poe. He is perhaps the most famous of the old school horror writers, and the story tonight we're going to read, well, we may read two. I will say that now. We'll see how long the first one takes. I don't think it'll take that long, but I've been wrong before. Pardon me. But the second one I think is a little less grim, a little more mysterious. The first one is pretty grim, though. GS says good evening. Good evening, GS. So as people who were here last week know, we're not exactly doing folk tales in October. We're doing sort of old classic, lesser known anyways, horror tales. With that in mind, Edgar Allan Poe, just as a sort of point of reference for you before we go into the stories, Poe has a very dramatic way of writing that wasn't terribly unusual for his time, especially for the ghost stories and the spookiness. One would say in a modern lens, he tends to overwrite. And the problem with overwriting, of course, is that at times it can be, if you're not accustomed to reading that, hard to know exactly what is being said or what is intended. So to that end, I'm going to read through it, but occasionally I will give you brief little summaries of sort of what that means, because I think some sections are fairly sensible, and other sections, if I didn't read them a couple of times, I would not have known what was going on. Sort of a non-traditional use of certain words and so on can really throw you off. So heavy description, heavy emphasis on drama. He is a drama queen with a capital D. And one other thing, just before we get into it, he is genuinely creepy. He earns his reputation. But he is a slow burn kind of creepy that builds towards an end. And when he hits his peak in the end, he cuts off. And so the reason I'm telling you that is, at first, it might seem like, why am I sitting here listening to this? It's just a guy being weird for a long time. And I think all I can say is just try to have some faith that Poe knows what he's doing and where he's going. And have some faith in myself that I chose a story that has an impact, especially this first one. I won't deny that he rambles more than he has to, but as you can tell, we writers share that trait. So with that in mind, let's get to the first Edgar Allan Poe story. Of course, if you've literally never heard of Edgar Allan Poe, you probably have, just before I get into it. His stories have been used for Simpsons stuff, if nothing else, in Halloween episodes. He's known for his sort of dark poetry. Usually his most famous stories are about guilty conscience, depravity and guilty conscience. Things like The Telltale Heart, which was a whole episode in The Simpsons, and then there's why am I blanking on it? The Raven. Yeah, The Raven, which there's a little short in one of the Halloween episodes where Bart is the Raven and they make some variations on the original poem. So you've definitely encountered Poe at some point. Okay. Hello, Suki. So this first story is Berenice. From Edgar Allan Poe. And there's a whole bunch of Latin in this, so ever so often I will just give you the translations rather than trying to read the Latin, because frankly no one knows how Latin was pronounced. It's all guesswork anyways. So this first quote here, translated, is direct, but it's a little weird. Members told me that if I were to visit my friend's grave, my concerns would be somewhat relieved. By Ibn Ziyad. This is Berenice by Edgar Allan Poe. Misery is manifold. The wretchedness of earth is multiform. Overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow, its hues are as various as the hues of that arch, as distinct, too, yet as intimately blended. Overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow, how is it that from beauty I have derived a type of unloveliness? From the covenant of peace, a simile of sorrow. But as, in ethics, evil is a consequence of good, so, in fact, out of joy is sorrow born. Either the memory of past bliss is the anguish of today, or the agonies which are have their origin in the ecstasies which might have been. My baptismal name is Egatius. That of my family I will not mention. Yet there are no towers in the land more time-honored than my gloomy, grey, hereditary halls. Our line has been called a race of visionaries, and in my striking particulars, in the character of the family mansion, in the frescoes of the chief saloon, in the tapestries of the dormitories, in the chiseling of some buttresses in the armory, but more especially in the gallery of antique paintings, in the fashion of the library chamber, and lastly, in the very peculiar nature of the library's contents, there is more than sufficient evidence to warrant the belief. The recollections of my earliest years are connected with that chamber, and with its volumes, of which latter I will say no more. Here died my mother. Herein was I born. But it is mere idleness to say that I had not lived before, that the soul has no previous existence. You deny it? Let us not argue the matter. Convinced myself, I seek not to convince. There is, however, a remembrance of aerial forms, of spiritual and meaning eyes, of sounds musical yet sad, a remembrance which will not be excluded. A memory like a shadow, vague, variable, indefinite, unsteady, and like a shadow too in the impossibility of my getting rid of it while the sunlight of my reason shall exist. In that chamber I was born. So he's talking about his family's massive library here, in case you lost track of that. Thus awaking from the long night of what seemed but was not nonentity, at once into the very regions of fairyland, into a palace of imagination, into the wild dominions of monastic thought and iridation. It is not singular that I gazed around me with a startled and ardent eye, that I loitered away my boyhood in books, and dissipated my youth in reverie, but it is singular that as years rolled away, and the noon of manhood found me still in the mansion of my fathers, it is wonderful what stagnation there fell upon the springs of my life. Wonderful how total an inversion took place in the character of my commonest thought. The realities of the world affected me as visions, and as visions only, where the wild ideas of the land of dreams became in turn not the material of my everyday existence, but the very deed that existed utterly and solely in itself. In other words, he spent his entire youth in the library, and the realities of books, whether they were musings or whether they were non-fiction fairy tales, anything like that, became more real to him than anything else. Berenice and I were cousins when we grew up together in my paternal halls, yet differently we grew. I, ill of health and buried in gloom, she, agile, graceful, and overflowing with energy. Hers the ramble on the hillside, mine the studies of the cloister. I living within my own heart and addicted, body and soul, to the most intense and painful meditation. She, roaming carelessly through life, with no thought of the shadows in her path, or the silent flight of the raven-winged hours. Berenice! I call upon her name. Berenice! And from the grey ruins of my memory 1,000 tumultuous recollections are startled at the sound. Vividly is her image before me now, and as in the early days of her light-heartedness and joy. O gorgeous yet fantastic beauty! O sylph amid the shrubberies of Arnheim! O naiad among its fountains! And then all is mystery and terror, a tale upon which should not be told. Disease. A fatal disease fell like the simoon upon her frame. And even while I gazed upon her, the spirit of her change swept over her, pervading her mind, her habits, and her character. And in a manner the most subtle and terrible, disturbing even the identity of her person. Alas, the destroyer came and went, and the victim, where is she? I knew her not, or knew her no longer as Berenice. Among the numerous train of maladies superinduced by that fatal and primary one, which effected a revolution of so horrible a kind in the moral and physical being of my cousin, may be mentioned as the most distressing and obstinate in nature, a species of epilepsy not unfrequently terminating in trance itself, trance very nearly resembling positive dissolution, from which her manner of recovering was in most instances startlingly abrupt. In the meantime, my own disease, for I have been told that I should call it by no other appellation, my own disease then grew rapidly upon me and assumed finally a monomaniac character of a novel and extraordinary form, hourly and momentarily gaining vigor, and at length obtaining over me the most incomprehensible ascendancy. This monomania, if I must so term it, consisted in a morbid irritability of those properties of the mind in the metaphysical science term the attentive. It is more than probable that I am not understood, but I fear, indeed, that it is no manner possible to convey to the mind of the merely general reader an adequate idea of that nervous intensity of interest in which, in my case, the powers of meditation, not to speak technically, busied and buried themselves in the contemplation of even the most ordinary objects of the universe. Now I realize that's a lot of words, so let me summarize. His cousin and him have maybe a romantic relationship. She is a pretty and carefree person, but she came down with epilepsy and other sort of fits, and it has affected her countenance. And in that, as it starts to affect her, I guess the stress of it has brought out a fixated kind of psychosis in him, where he fixates on details, which he's going to describe here in a moment. To muse for long unwearied hours with my attention riveted to some frivolous device on the margin or in the typography of a book. To become absorbed for the better part of a summer's day in a quaint shadow falling aslant upon the tapestry or upon the floor. To lose myself for an entire night in watching the steady flame of a lamp, or the embers of a fire, to dream away whole days over the perfume of a flower, to repeat monotonously some common word, until the sound by dint of frequent repetition ceased to convey any idea whatever to the mind, to lose all sense of motion or physical existence by means of absolute bodily quiescence, long and obstinately persevered in. Such were a few of the most common and least pernicious vagaries induced by the condition of the mental faculties, not, indeed, altogether unparalleled, but certainly bidding defiance to anything like analysis or explanation. Yet let me not be misapprehended. The undue earnest and morbid attention thus excited by objects in their own nature frivolous must not be confounded in character with that ruminating propensity common to all mankind, and more especially indulged in by persons of ardent imagination. It was not even, as might be at first supposed, in extreme condition or exaggeration of such propensity, and primarily and essentially distinct and different. In the one instance, the dreamer or enthusiast, being interested by an object usually not frivolous, imperceptibly loses sight of this object in a wilderness of deductions and suggestions issuing therefrom, until at the conclusion of a daydream, often replete with luxury, he finds the incitatum, or the first cause of his musings, entirely vanished and forgotten. So, before I read the rest of that paragraph, let me add, what he's saying is, this obsession that arose in him, as he started to obsess, he started to realize that there was an initial point of obsession that triggered it. And that's what he's going to describe. In my case, the primary object was invariably frivolous, although assuming, through the medium of my distempered vision, a refracted and unreal importance. Few deductions, if any, were made, and those few pertinaciously returning in upon the original object as a center. The meditations were never pleasurable, and at the termination of the reverie, the first cause, so far from being out of sight, had attained that supernaturally exaggerated interest which was the prevailing feature of the disease. In a word, the powers of mind more particularly exercised were, with me, as I've said before, the attentive, and are with the daydreamer, the speculative. My books at this epoch, if they did not actually serve to irritate the disorder, partook, it will be perceived largely in their imaginative and inconsequential nature, of the characteristic qualities of the disorder itself. I will well remember, among others, the treatise of the noble Italian Coelius Secundus Curio, De Amplitudini Beati Regni Dei, St. Austin's great work, The City of God. These are books. He's just naming books. And Tertullian's De Carne Christi, which means the body of Christ, in which the paradoxical sentence that I will not try to read in its original Latin, but I will read you what it means. This is a direct translation again. The Son of God died, it is credible that it is silly. He rose and was buried, it is certain that is impossible. Occupied my undivided time for many weeks of laborious and fruitless investigation. Thus it will appear that, shaken from its balance only by trivial things, my reason bore a resemblance to that ocean crag spoken of by Ptolemy Hephaestion, who's a historian in ancient Greece, known for kind of absurdist, sensationalist history accounts, which steadily are resisting the attacks of human violence and the fiercer fury of the waters, and the winds trembled only to the touch of the flower called asphodel. And although to a careless thinker it might appear a matter beyond doubt that the alteration produced by her unhappy malady in the moral condition of Berenice would afford me many objects for the exercise of that intense and abnormal meditation whose nature I have been at some trouble in explaining, yet such was not in any degree that case. In the lucid intervals of my infirmity, her calamity indeed gave me pain, and taking deeply to heart that total wreck of her fair and gentle life, I did not fail to ponder, frequently and bitterly, upon the wonder-working means by which so strange a revolution had been so suddenly brought to pass. In other words, how much her disease wrecked her so quickly. But these reflections partook not of the idiosyncrasy of my disease, which was obsession on his side, and were such as would have occurred under similar circumstances to the ordinary mass of mankind. True to its own character, my disorder reveled in the less important but more startling changes wrought in the physical frame of Berenice, in the singular and most appalling distortion of her personal identity, in other words, her actual physical body change due to the illness. During the brightest days of her unparalleled beauty, most surely I had never loved her. In the strange anomaly of my existence, feelings with me had never been of the heart, and my passions always were of the mind. Through the gray of the early morning, among the trellised shadows of the forest at explaining, yet such was not in any degree the case. In the lucid intervals of my infirmity, her calamity indeed gave me pain, and taking deeply to heart that total wreck of her fair and gentle life, I did not fail to ponder frequently. No, wait, we already read this. Sorry. Among the trellis shadows of the forest at noonday, there we go, and in the silence of my library at night, she had flitted by my eyes, and I had seen her, not as the living and breathing Berenice, but as the Berenice of a dream, not as being of the earth, earthy, but as the abstraction of such a being, not as a thing to admire, but to analyze, not as an object of love, but as the theme of the most abstruse, although desultory speculation. And now I shuddered in her presence, and grew pale at her approach. Yet bitterly lamenting her fallen and desolate condition, I called to mind that she had loved me long, and in an evil moment I spoke to her of marriage. And at length the period of our nuptials was approaching, when upon an afternoon in the winter of the year, one of those unseasonably warm, calm, and misty days which are the nurse of the beautiful Halcyon, I sat as I thought alone, in the inner apartment of the library, but uplifting my eyes I saw that Berenice stood before me. Was it my own excited imagination, or the misty influence of the atmosphere, or the uncertain twilight of the chamber, or the gray draperies which fell around her figure, that caused in it so vacillating and indistinct an outline? I could not tell. She spoke no word, and I, not for worlds could I have uttered a syllable. An icy chill ran through my frame. A sense of insufferable anxiety oppressed me. A consuming curiosity pervaded my soul, and sinking back upon the chair, I remained for some time breathless and motionless, with my eyes riveted upon her person. Alas, its emaciation was excessive, and not one vestige of the former being lurked in any single line of the contour. My burning glances at length fell upon the face. The forehead was high, and very pale, and singularly placid, and the once jetty hair fell partially over it, overshadowed the hollow temples with innumerable ringlets, now of a vivid yellow, and jarring discordantly in the fantastic character with the reigning melancholy of the countenance. The eyes were lifeless, and lusterless, and seemingly pupilless, and I shrank involuntarily from their glassy stare to the contemplation of the thin and shrunken lips. They parted, and in a smile of peculiar meaning, the teeth of the changed Berenice disclosed themselves slowly to my view. Would to God I had never beheld them, or that having done so, I'd have died. So she walked into his... He offers her marriage, even though they're cousins. I really don't know if that's meant to be a part of the weirdness of this story, or if that's just normal. For that time, she walks into his study, and he is struck by how much she does no longer look like herself because of the disease. But she smiles at him, and he notices her teeth. The shutting of a door disturbed me, and looking up, I found that my cousin had departed from the chamber, but from the disordered chamber of my brain had not, alas, departed, and would not be driven away, the white and ghastly spectrum of the teeth. Not a speck on their surface, not a shade on the enamel, not an indenture in the edges. But what that period of her smile had sufficed to brand in upon my memory, I saw them now even more unequivocally than I had beheld them then. The teeth! The teeth! They were here and there and everywhere, and visibly and palpably before me, long, narrow, and excessively white, with pale lips writhing about them, as in the very moment of their first terrible development. Then came the full fury of my monomania, and I struggled in vain against its strange and irresistible influence. In the multiplied objects of the external world I had no thoughts but for the teeth. For these I longed with a frenzied desire. All other matters and all different interests became absorbed in their single contemplation. They alone were present to the mental eye, and they, in their sole individuality, became the essence of my mental life. I held them in every light. I turned them in every attitude. I surveyed their characteristics. I dwelt upon their peculiarities. I pondered upon their conformation. I mused upon the alteration in their nature. I shuddered as I assigned to them in imagination a sensitive and sentient power, and even when unassisted by the lips, a capability of moral expression. Of Mademoiselle Sal, it's been said que tu sais pas atteignant des sentiments. Wow, I can speak French, by the way. That fell apart on me, though. And of Berenice, I more seriously believed que tu sais atteindre des idées. And if you want the translation for that, roughly speaking, the first one is, in all her steps were feeling, but the second one is in all her teeth, or in all their teeth, were ideas. The ideas, des idées. Here the idiotic thought that destroyed me, des idées. And therefore it was that I coveted them so madly. I felt that their possession could alone ever restore me to peace, in giving me back to reason. And the evening closed in upon me thus, and then the darkness came, and tarried and went, and the day again dawned, and the midst of the mists of a second night were now gathering around, and still I sat motionless in that solitary room, and still I sat buried in meditation. And still the phantasma of the teeth maintained its terrible ascendancy, as, with the most vivid, hideous distinctness, it floated about amid the changing lights and shadows of the chamber. At length there broke in upon my dreams a cry of horror and dismay, and thereunto, after a pause, succeeded the sound of troubled voices. intermingled with many low moanings of sorrow or of pain. I arose from my seat, and throwing open one of the doors of the library, saw standing out in the antechamber a servant maiden, all in tears, who told me that Berenice was no more. She'd been seized with epilepsy in the early morning, and now, at the closing in of the night, the grave was ready for its tenant, and all the preparations for the burial were completed. So he became fixated with her teeth. 2 days later, she died, and they're burying her. I found myself sitting in the library, and again sitting there alone. It seemed that I had newly awakened from a confused and exciting dream. I knew that it was now midnight, and I was well aware that since the setting of the sun, Berenice had been interred. But of that dreary period which intervened, I had no positive, at least no definite comprehension. In other words, I don't really remember it. Yet its memory was replete with horror more horrible from being vague, and terror more terrible from ambiguity. It was a fearful page in the record of my existence, written all over with dim and hideous and unintelligible recollections. I strive to decipher them, but in vain. While ever and anon, like the spirit of a departed sound, the shrill and piercing shriek of a female voice seemed to be ringing in my ears. I had done a deed. What was it? I asked myself that question aloud, and the whispering echoes of the chamber answered me. What was it? On the table beside me burned a lamp, and near it lay a little box. It was of no remarkable character, and I had seen it frequently before, for it was the property of the family physician. But how came it there, upon my table, and why did I shudder in regarding it? These things were in no manner to be accounted for. My eyes at length dropped to the open pages of a book, and to a sentence underscored therein. The words were the singular but simple ones of the poet Ibn Zayat. And that is the one we opened with. People told me that if I were to visit my friend's grave, my concerns would be somewhat relieved. Why then, as I perused them, did the hairs on my head erect themselves on end, and the blood of my body become congealed within my veins? There came a light tap at the library door, and pale as the tenant of a tomb, a menial entered upon tiptoe. His looks were wild with terror, and he spoke to me in a voice tremulous, husky, and very low. What said he? Some broken sentences I heard. He told of a wild cry disturbing the silence of the night, of the gathering together of the household, of a search in the direction of the sound, and then his tones grew thrillingly distinct as he whispered me of a violated grave, of a disfigured body enshrouded, yet still breathing, still palpitating, still alive. In other words, she was buried alive. He pointed to garments. They were muddy, clotted with gore. I spoke not. He took me gently by the hand, and it was indented with the impress of human nails. He directed my attention to some object against the wall. I looked at it for some minutes. It was a spade. With a shriek, I bounded to the table and grasped the box that lay upon it, but I could not force it open, and in my tremor it slipped from my hands and fell heavily and burst into pieces, and from it, with a rattling sound, there rolled out some instruments of dental surgery, intermingled with 32 small, white and ivory-looking substances that were scattered to and fro about the floor. And that is Berenice by Edgar Allan Poe. GS says perfect Poe music. Yeah, I think I know what track you're talking about. It definitely lined up well. So in case you didn't gather the full impact of that story, because like I said, he definitely writes around things quite a bit. Though I think it is a part of the atmosphere of the story. I'm not sure I would ask that it would be overall changed in tone. But what I will say is just a quick summary of that ending, in case you didn't pick up on it. His cousin had a major fit. They thought she was dead. They buried her in the night as he was obsessing about her teeth. He goes down and unburies her to pull all her teeth out. And unfortunately, she was still alive. So, but he was in some kind of psychosis, so he pinned her down and pulled all her teeth out, is the implication here. That's why he has human fingernail wounds on his hands. Which is, I'll admit, creepier than anything I would have thought of. I mean, that's twofold. Burying someone alive is an obsession, actually, of Edgar Allan Poe in general. There's a few stories he has with it. But pulling someone's teeth out, holy crap. All right. Well, I'll give you a moment to catch your breath on that one. I think we'll probably read at least something from Lovecraft this month, even though he's not a good person in any sense of the word, and he's not even that good of a writer. He is an excellent world builder, and I am a fan of that in spite of myself. He very obviously pulls a lot from Edgar Allan Poe, and he has the same problem of Poe being an overwriter, though I would say Poe is overall a better writer than him. Anybody who tells you that, at least on a prose level, Lovecraft is a great writer, he is not. He is not a good writer. He is incredibly corny, even for his time, overwritten nonsense. But he does, ever so often, create wonderful atmospheres and interesting worlds. Okay. We do have enough time for this story, because this story is substantially shorter than the other one. This one's called The Oval Portrait. And I think you might even sort of recognize it a bit. Because it was an inspiration for a later and more famous, frankly, book. So we'll see if anybody in the chat can figure out what book. He's the originator of the idea in this story, which is very short. But see if anybody can tag what book it was that it inspired later. GS says, I didn't think Poe added any words that didn't enhance the story. I guess I agree. I think it's very suiting to the perspective of the person who's talking. Somebody who grew in a library, absolutely obsessive about old Latin phrasing and stuff. Like, I think the character building is strong through that voice. The problem is, ever so often, I think he could pause and say something in a far more straightforward way just to make sure that his audience could understand key anchor points. And kind of what I was trying to do by adding that in is give you that. Now, that isn't as common a thing in old writing, Victorian writing and stuff of Poe's era. But in modern writing, we basically, I don't think the average reader, especially if you're just hearing someone read it and you're not looking at it and able to review a sentence a few times, I don't think the average reader is very trained on that kind of reading, that really unhelpful, unsympathetic, overwritten thing. So this is called The Oval Portrait. It's by Edgar Allan Poe, and it was later inspired another story of a much longer story, frankly. There is very little explanation on the context of the opening, by the way, and it never really comes. So don't get too fixated on like what exactly is going on in with the main person telling the story. It's not crucial to the story, and it's a very strange beginning. But this is very short. It's just more of a thought. It's not as dark and gruesome as the others. The Oval Portrait by Edgar Allan Poe. The chateau into which my valet had ventured to make forcible entrance, rather than permit me, in my desperately wounded condition, to pass a night in the open air, was one of those piles of commingled gloom and grandeur which have so long frowned upon the Apennines, not less in fact in the fancy of Mrs. Radcliffe. To all appearances it had been temporarily and very lately abandoned. We established ourselves in one of the smallest and least sumptuously furnished apartments. It lay in a remote turret of the building. Its decorations were rich, yet tattered and antique. Its walls were hung with tapestry and bedecked with manifold and multiform armorial trophies, together with an unusually great number of very spirited modern paintings in frames of rich golden arabesque. In these paintings, which depended from the walls, not only in their main surface, but in the very many nooks which the bizarre architecture of the chateau rendered necessary, in these paintings my incipient delirium, perhaps, had caused me to take deep interest, so that I bade Pedro to close the heavy shutters of the room, since it was already night, to light the tongues of a tall candelabrum, which stood by the head of my bed, and to throw open far and wide the fringed curtains of black velvet which enveloped the bed itself. I wished all this done that I might resign myself, if not to sleep, at least alternately to the contemplation of these pictures, and the perusal of a small volume which had been found upon the pillow, a book, by the way, in case you're not familiar with the term volume, in that use, in which purported to criticize and describe the paintings. Long I read, and devotedly I gazed. Rapidly and gloriously the hours flew by, and the deep midnight came. The position of the candelabrum displeased me, and outreaching my hand with difficulty, rather than disturb my slumbering valet, I placed it so as to throw its rays more fully upon the book. But that action produced an effect altogether unanticipated. The rays of the numerous candles, for there were many, now fell within a niche of the room, which had hitherto been thrown into deep shade by one of the bedposts. I thus saw in vivid light a picture all unnoticed before. It was the portrait of a young girl just ripening into womanhood. I glanced at the painting hurriedly, and then closed my eyes. Why I did this was not at first apparent even to my own perception. But while my lids remained thus shut, I ran over in my mind my reason for so shutting them. It was an impulsive moment, to gain time for thought, to make sure that my vision had not deceived me, to calm and subdue my fancy for a more sober and more certain gaze. In a very few moments I again looked fixedly at the painting. That I now saw aright, I could not and would not doubt, for the first flashing of the candles upon that canvas had seemed to dissipate the dreamy stupor which was stealing over my senses, and to startle me at once into waking life. The portrait, I have already said, was that of a young girl. It was a mere head and shoulders, done in what is technically termed a vignette manner, much in the style of the favorite heads of Solly. The arms, the bosom, and even the ends of the radiant hair melted imperceptibly into the vague yet deep shadow which formed the background of the whole. The frame was oval, richly gilded and filigreed and moresque. As a thing of art, nothing could be more admirable than the painting itself, but it could have been neither the execution of the work nor the immortal beauty of the countenance, which had so suddenly and so vehemently moved me. Least of all, it could have been that in my fancy, shaken from its half-slumber, had mistaken the head for that of a living person. I saw at once that the peculiarities of the design, of the vignetting, and of the frame may have instantly dispelled such idea, must have prevented even in its momentary entertainment. Thinking earnestly upon these points, I remained for an hour perhaps, half sitting, half reclining, with my vision riveted upon the portrait. At length, satisfied with the true secret of its effect, I fell back within the bed. I had found the spell of the picture in an absolute lifelikeliness of expression which, at first startling, finally confounded, subdued, and even appalled me. With deep and reverent awe, I replaced the candelabrum in its former position. The cause of my deep agitation being thus shut from view, I sought eagerly the volume which discussed the paintings and their histories. Turning to the number which designated the oval portrait, I there read the vague and quaint words which follow. She was a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee. And evil was the hour when she saw and loved and wedded the painter. He, passionate, studious, austere, and having already a bride in his art, she, a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee, all light and smiles, and frolicsome as the young fawn, loving and cherishing all things its hating only the art which was her rival, dreading only the palette and brushes and other untoward instruments which deprived her of the countenance of her lover. It was thus a terrible thing for this lady to hear the painter speak of his desire to portray even his young bride. But she was humble and obedient, and sat meekly for many weeks in the dark, high turret chamber where the light dripped upon the pale canvas only from overhead. But he, the painter, took glory in his work, which went on from hour to hour and from day to day. And he was a passionate and wild and moody man who became lost in reverie, so that he could not see the light which fell so ghastly in that lone turret, withered the health and the spirits of his bride, who pined visibly to all but him. Yet she smiled on, and still on, uncomplainingly, because she saw that the painter, who had high renown, took a fervid and burning pleasure in his task, and wrought day and night to depict her who so loved him, yet who grew daily more dispirited and weak. And in sooth, some who beheld the portrait spoke of its resemblance in low words, as if of a mighty marvel, and a proof not less of the power of the painter than of his deep love for her whom he depicted so surpassingly well. But at length, as the labor drew nearer to its conclusion, there were admitted none into the turret, for the painter had grown wild with the ardor of his work, and turned his eyes from the canvas merely, even to regard the countenance of his wife, and he would not see that the tints which he spread upon the canvas were drawn from the cheeks of her who sat beside him. And when many weeks had passed, but little remained to do, save one brush upon the mouth and one tint upon the eye, the spirit of the lady again flickered up as a flame within the socket of the lamp. And then the brush was given, and then the tint was placed. And for one moment the painter stood entranced before the work he had wrought. But in the next, while he yet gazed, he grew tremulous and very pallid, and aghast, and crying with a loud voice, "This is indeed life itself!" turned suddenly to regard his beloved. She was dead. GS got it right away. Picture of Dorian Gray. Obviously, the nature of it is different. GS says they must have burned through large quantities of candles. I guess I had pictured it as moonlight, but I don't really have any basis for that. Rapunzel. No, Rapunzel is a story that would predate Poe, but Poe predates Dorian Gray. It's basically about a painter who inadvertently and magically through, this is common for Victorian kind of horror and ghost tales, sucks the life out of the thing he loves to turn it into art. So, those are the two stories I wanted to read, and man, did it line up perfectly on time. Leaving me a couple of minutes here to just say, if you enjoyed this story, last week we read a story from Arthur Conan Doyle, who, if you didn't know, yes, he does Sherlock Holmes, but he was also a very famous and very influential horror writer. And we read technically actually a pretty famous story from him on the horror side, but I don't think anything from his horror side is particularly widely read anymore. So a lesser known nonetheless thing about a leather funnel. That'll be in the same playlist that this is in, Fireside Fairytales. But also we are currently doing a multi-part little short stories about horror stories where you guys in chat are helping me write it. On Thursdays, we wrote the first section of it last Thursday. Premise being that I have been in an abandoned art gallery and weird things happened. I won't say more than that. So if you want to watch on Thursday at 6:30 where we continue it, you don't have to watch the first one, but it definitely will help you. And come and help us write. GS says incredible choices, Rory, and beautifully read. Thank you. Thank you. I will say, I don't usually take compliments this way. This is a challenging person to read. He has incredibly long sentences with no breaks, so you really have to pace out your breath and stuff. He's a challenging person to read. It's definitely books that were not really made to be read aloud. It's not to say that they don't sound good read aloud, but you can tell when a writer intends them to be read aloud. So, for example, our Irish fairy tales with Yeats that we've been reading, those are written in a way where it's clear they're meant to be aloud. They're meant to be read aloud over around a fireplace or a pub or something. These are stories that are clearly not meant to be read aloud. And it shows in how the pacing of the breath and all that is. So, with that said, I will say there are a couple of things to note about Edgar Allan Poe, if you are interested. One of them is just sort of a personal observation of mine, but I will leave that last. The first is there are obsessive themes in Edgar Allan Poe's work that reflect his obsessive characters. So it seems likely that he himself was a pretty obsessive person. One of the things he obviously had a fixation on was being buried alive. The other thing was this kind of morbid fascination and fear of destroying beautiful women by your affections. And it's really interesting to me, especially that first story, because in the time he's writing, it certainly wouldn't have been thought of much. But there's this idea of objectification. I'm sure you've heard this before, but objectification of people, in particular women. is the idea of treating another human being either in terms of their parts or objects, right? And it's interesting to me the way that all these points that have been made about objectification 100 or more years later of women are captured in that first story. The idea that like he never really has affection, but he kind of keeps her around. And it's the same thing that's echoed in this story about objectifying her as an object of his art. She's beautiful. She loves him with genuine affection, but he sees her as an object of art, and it kills her. And in the case of the teeth, well, he claims to have these sort of intellectual appreciation and whatever, but at the end of the day, he was obsessed with the teeth. And therefore, even though it was when he dug her up and found that she was still alive, he still pins her down and pulls her teeth out because he wants them. Who cares about her as a person? And I think those observations are really probably not entirely intentional, but strangely progressive. You don't see that in most of the other ghost stories I've been watching, or reading rather. The other thing I'll note that's been a challenge with picking ghost stories is the thing that's probably the scariest overall, apparently, to old Victorian people was other races, especially visible minorities. And so stories that you may have heard of, what you don't know is there's completely arbitrary and unimportant sections about black people and Jews and Arabs being mysterious and haunting and cursing, and like there's these things that I just don't really want to put out there anymore. Even if they are old stories, if you want to read them, they're freely available. But they're in everything, to the extent that certain keywords I will search through stories before I even read them, because I know if those are in there, I'm probably not going to read it on this stream. But Edgar Allan Poe is the one person from this era who I got no hits on any of that. Now, I'm not saying that he has no racist content at all. I have no idea. I don't know his full works. But he certainly has none that I could find, which is really unusual for Victorian horror writers. Men or women, by the way. And between that and these strangely salient and sympathetic observations of the experiences of women in marriages and so on, make him a very interesting character to me. He obviously relates to this obsessiveness, but I feel like there is a strange depth of empathy to his work that I didn't really notice before, because I have read him before, but not in this kind of, not on my own time really, as a part of courses and stuff I've read him. So those were my thoughts. And I put them at the end because if you don't care about them, you would have clicked off by now. Nonetheless, I will see you on Thursday. Take care of each other out there. And I hope you're having an enjoyable, spooky October. Anyways, try and get some sleep.